President Joe Biden hosted Philippine President Ferdinand Marcos Jr. and Japanese Prime Minister Fumio Kishida, aiming to send a clear message to Beijing that it must stop behaving aggressively against its South China Sea neighbors. White House Bureau Chief Patsy Widakuswara reports.
Ramped up aggression in the South China Sea, with Chinese Coast Guard vessels deploying water cannons and performing other dangerous maneuvers on Philippine boats. It was a focus of the Trilateral Summit Thursday between President Joe Biden and leaders of two U.S. allies in Asia, Japanese Prime Minister Fumio Kishida and Philippine President Ferdinand Marcos Jr.
Any attack on Philippine aircraft, vessels, or armed forces in the South China Sea would invoke our Mutual Defense Treaty.
China's so-called gray zone tactics of intimidation, including ramming into ships, fall dangerously close to triggering the Mutual Defense Treaty between Washington and Manila. Marcos did not publicly mention China, but couched his words in diplomatic terms often used to target Beijing.
Facing the complex challenges of our time requires concerted efforts on everyone's part, a dedication to a common purpose, and an unwavering commitment to the rules-based international order.
Kishida is concerned with similar Chinese tactics around disputed islands in the East China Sea, called Diaoyu in China and Senkaku in Japan.
In the midst of compound crisis faced by the global community, multi-layered cooperation between allies and like-minded countries is essential if we are to maintain and bolster a free and open international order based on the rule of law.
Last week, the Philippines, the U.S., Japan, and Australia held joint naval and air operations in the South China Sea to deter Beijing, prompting criticism by Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesperson Mao Ning.
China is resolutely opposed to the Cold War mentality and bloc politics, and to words and deeds that make and exacerbate contradictions and undermine other countries' strategic security and interests.
Biden, Marcos, and Kishida announced new maritime defense deterrence measures alongside infrastructure investments in the Philippines and collaboration on global humanitarian assistance efforts. Patsy Widakuswara, Viewing News, Washington.
And to discuss more about the historic Trilateral Summit, we have Jessica Stone, VOA correspondent. Good morning, Jessica. Thank you for joining us here on PTV News tonight.
Pleasure to be with you.
Okay, we've gotten a lot of information about this Trilateral Summit, but first of all, how did the idea for the summit even come about?
Well, National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan says this has been under discussion since June of last year when he and his counterparts met in Tokyo, and they agreed to enhance the partnership. White House Asia hand Amira Rapp-Hooper also says that these countries are all shared the same values and the same vision for the region, and that the time was right for a leader-level summit. So that's where we stand today.
Okay, speaking of what is to come in the future, what roles are the Philippines and Japan expected to play, especially for us, for our country?
Yeah, it's an important question because you're seeing these mini-laterals take the place of what used to be a multilateral and large group of alliances within the region. And the Philippines plays a key role, of course, because of those additional EDCA sites where there are temporarily stationed U.S. troops, but no permanent troops, but the ability to stage assets there for the U.S. military. And then the Japanese come in with the command and control, working on better relaying that to the United States military. This is something President Marcos has pushed for in terms of getting an assurance from President Biden that any attack on the Philippines would trigger that defense treaty. It's something he's been working for. And so that quote, that statement that you heard in Patsy's package is so important to understand that it's not just the relationships that the U.S. has with Korea and with Japan, but the Philippines as well, that would trigger that mutual defense treaty, and that applies, in fact, to what happens in the West Philippine Sea. Last year in his California meeting, we know that President Biden did directly appeal to Xi Jinping and the Chinese president about this matter. Clearly, nothing has really changed in terms of how the Chinese military and the Chinese Coast Guard are executing these so-called gray zone attacks in the region. especially around the Second Thomas Shoal, where Manila has a permanent military presence. But as you well know, and you've documented extensively, there are repeated run-ins between the Chinese and the Philippines there. This week, we heard Beijing reiterate that it still believes that resupply missions to Second Thomas Shoal are considered a violation of its sovereignty, and that it wants the Philippines to ask for permission to serve that military outpost. In a joint statement released after the summit, we also heard Japan say that the U.S. and the Philippines express our serious concerns about the People's Republic of China's dangerous and aggressive behavior in the South China Sea, also known as the West Philippine Sea. We are also concerned by the militarization of reachers and unlawful maritime claims in the South China Sea. So we see the Japanese and the United States taking the same position with respect to how to interact with the Philippines in the West Philippine Sea, because of course Japan, as Patsy pointed out, has very similar concerns with the Japanese behavior around the Diaoyu Islands.
Okay, speaking about these confrontations, how did the Trilateral Summit specifically address these affronts between the Chinese and Philippine vessels in the West Philippine Sea? Can you tell us more about that?
Sure. This is very clearly addressed by President Biden when he says these two, that anything that happens to the Philippines, any attack, he says, on Philippine aircraft vessels or armed forces in the West Philippine Sea would invoke our mutual defense treaty. And again, this is something that President Marcos has pushed for. And so we're finally hearing those words out of U.S. President Joe Biden's mouth. And the Philippines is a key part of the U.S. defense strategy. As I said earlier, there's no permanent troops stationed there. But the Philippines also needs to retrofit its military assets. So in addition to what we heard from President Biden, we're also seeing action in the U.S. Senate. They have proposed that $2.5 billion, I should say, in grants to allow the Philippines to retrofit its military to purchase more weapons and assets from the United States. The hope, of course, there is to discourage these so-called gray zone attacks.
A lot of talk about an outpouring of pledges and support financially. What about economic outcomes? What can you tell us about that?
Well, these are really coming alongside the defense architecture that's being agreed to by these three countries. And what we saw announced this week is a increase in semiconductor manufacturing that's been brought on by that visit from Gina Raimondo, the U.S. Commerce Secretary last month, who promised to double the number of semiconductor manufacturing investments with another $1 billion in U.S. investments. There are currently 13. She wants to see 26. And then we also saw this week a pledge by Google. $1 billion they say they're going to spend in 2 undersea cables to connect the Guam and the CNMI, or the Commonwealth of the Northern Mariana Islands, to Japan and the United States. These are critical spots in the U.S. defense architecture, and they need to be connected for communications purposes to the rest of the region on the Western Pacific. We also saw that U.S., Japan, Philippines announcement about an infrastructure partnership to connect the Bay at Subic Bay to Clark, to Manila, to Batangas. These are all parts of really pushing back against that Belt and Road Initiative style of investment, countering it with U.S. and Japanese foreign investment, the U.S. Development Company, or I should say corporation, putting a stamp on the ground, so to speak, by making sure that its first office in the region is going to be in the Philippines. And that also could lead up foreign direct investment, particularly from the United States, into the Philippines.
Okay, thank you, Jessica. I'd like to just slip in one last question, if you don't mind. The Trilateral Summit has been a huge success, and therefore its continuity is paramount. With the elections coming in just a few months, has there been any talk on how to further this continuity, if any?
Well, it's a key question that's been asked by many U.S. allies. And of course, there are not just elections in the United States, but elections coming up in other parts of Asia, particularly in Japan. And so continuity with democracies does, to some extent, come and go from who's in leadership. And we know that former President Donald Trump is not as keen on these multilateral agreements as is U.S. President Joe Biden. But some of the infrastructure, the more the infrastructure can be laid and gotten on the ground, really defense analysts would argue the better ahead of that election. Now, time is tight. We have the election in November. But if these things are codified in law and policy, if they are already funded, that at least gives them some legs, so to speak. But there is a risk with any democracy as the governments change, and we certainly saw this in South Korea's government with how they've interacted with North Korea. There's been a real change there as well. These changes can happen, and there is a conversation going on in Washington, as I'm sure there is in Manila, about the implications of that.
Thank you very much, Jessica Stone.